evening. Are there any visionaries here? Anybody who sort of has visionary tendencies? Well, we value the few of you who are out there. So I have some visionary tendencies, and that's kind of a nice way of saying I have great ideas and poor follow through. So an example of this, a few years ago, it was the beginning of 2021. I've been married for a couple of years, about a year and a half. And I decided, I want to take my family leadership to the next level. We are going to start having monthly family meetings. And so I put together a PowerPoint for our monthly family meeting. Slide 1 was our theme verse for the month. This is our guiding verse, something to kind of set our course for the month. And then, we go through different areas of our life. I want to make sure everything's under control. So we're going to spend some time talking about how, our spiritual goals are looking. What are our spiritual goals? What are our physical goals? What are our emotional goals? What are our intellectual goals? What are our social goals, our organizational goals, our occupational goals, our financial goals? So, I had like a few bullet points for each thing. These are our goals. These are how we've been doing. And it was fantastic. So that was January 2021. We had our first official Mitchell Incorporated family meeting. February 2021 came around, and we had the second meeting. March 2021 came around, and we had a little disturbance in our life, had our baby, so there was no meeting for that month. April 2021, there was no meeting for that month either, or for May, or for June, or for any of the months that followed. So I've only had 2 family meetings. So, but it was a great vision. It was a great vision to have, take charge of our family leadership, or take charge of leading the family, and that vision kind of fell through. So there are a lot of other examples I could share of things I've started and I haven't finished. But in my walk with God, that is the one thing I want to say I've started and I will finish. I can try a new diet for a while. I can try a new thing working with my family for a while. I can try a new schedule for a while. But my relationship with God is non-negotiable. That's something that I want people to look at me and say, he was committed. He started the race and he finished it strong. So as we think about finishing the race strong, what are some things that can derail us? What are some things that can pull us off that track? Please open your Bible to 1 Corinthians chapter 10. We're going to kind of spend some time starting here, working through here, and jumping out of here to some other passages. And my goal here tonight is to think about how can we build a foundation for a strong, committed Christian life that we see through to the end, where we rise above the distractions, we rise above the temptations, and we are alert to the things that can tempt us. We are alert to the things that could pull us off that track. That's my goal for tonight, is how can we finish that race strong and avoid the distractions and temptations that surround us. So to set the stage for 1 Corinthians 10, the very first word in my version is for. And so I don't think we do the chapter justice unless we go back and look at why this chapter starts out with for. What is this for? What is the upcoming text here for? And so recapping chapter 9, we see Paul talking about his apostleship. We see Paul talking about how important it is to him to make sure the gospel is spread, to make sure he becomes all things to all men, so that he by some, I by some means might save some. And then at the end of chapter 9, he talks about the race. Talks about, don't you know that in a race, all runners run, but only one receives the prize? So run that you may obtain it. Every athlete exercises self-control in all things. They do it to receive a perishable wreath, but we an imperishable. So, I do not run aimlessly. I do not box as one beating the air, but I discipline my body and keep it under control, lest after preaching to others, I myself should be disqualified. So Paul's concern here is finishing that race strong, not being disqualified, disciplining himself so he is effectively carrying out the mission that God put him here for. And so with that in mind, we go into chapter 10, and he says, "For I do not want you to be unaware, brothers, that our fathers were all under the cloud, and all passed through the sea, and all were baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea, and all ate the same spiritual food, and all drank the same spiritual drink. For they drank from the spiritual rock that followed them, and the rock was Christ." So he looks back at Israel's ancestors, and he helps them see these people who are in our past, our ancestors here, they lived in the presence of God. They lived in the cloud of God's leadership. They passed through the sea. They experienced his miraculous provision. They were baptized into Moses. They went down into the sea, followed Moses' leadership, God-ordained leadership, and came back out of the sea. And that sea closed in behind them. Essentially, they had committed their entire lives to following God's leadership through Moses. There was no turning back now. So, because these people had this spiritual experience, you think these would be people who we could look up to as like, okay, they lived in God's presence, they experienced his miraculous provision, they followed his leadership. However, verse 5 tells us more. It says, "Nevertheless, with most of them God was not pleased, for they were overthrown in the wilderness. Now these things took place as examples for us, that we might not desire evil as they did." Oh, okay, so now we see another side of the picture. Yeah, they might have been in this situation where they had the opportunity to follow God and experience all these wonderful things from God, but we see that they're desiring evil things. Desire is a big thing. 1 John chapter 2, a verse that you've probably heard before, repeated often, because it sums up desire very succinctly and how there are some dangerous desires out there. 1 John 2, starting 15, says, "Do not love the world or the things in the world. If anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him. For all that is in the world, the desires of the flesh, the desires of the eyes, and the pride of life is not from the Father, but is from the world. And the world is passing away along with its desires. But whoever does the will of God abides forever." So let's pick this apart a little bit. What is the desire of the flesh? Well, you know, our body has natural desires. It has natural wants and needs. And in the right situations, we need to fulfill those. We're hungry, we need to eat. We're thirsty, we need to drink. We don't want to live out in the cold, so we have homes or places to stay that shelter us from the cold, that give us some comfort. We have sexual desires. And these are things that are all legitimate to fulfill in certain ways. But the desire that is talking about here is when those are taken to a point where they're fulfilled in excess. They're fulfilled outside of the boundaries that God has given us. Illegitimate sexual pleasure or sexual indulgence, gluttony, drinking, Maybe the overindulgence in comfort, where to the point of laziness or complacency. And then we look at the desire of eyes, the desire for beautiful things. God created beauty. I mean, we live in Alaska, I think we can all agree on that. God created beauty. However, sometimes we can pervert that desire for beauty. We can want to own beautiful things, that people can see our beautiful things and admire us. We want to maybe spend a bunch of time and money on our own appearance to the point where our appearance has become an idol, and we want people to appreciate our appearance. Perhaps we really, it's not beautiful things are good, but when we overindulge in that and make the beauty the focus and make that beauty something we want to draw attention from others and draw glory away from God, that beauty has become a worldly desire that is mentioned here. And then finally, the pride of life. This is the desire for status, the desire for fame, the desire for maybe elite social connections, a lavish lifestyle, a prestigious occupation, an elite occupation, or a prestigious education. You want to brush shoulders with famous people, important people. You want to be in those circles. This is the pride of life, when this is what we are chasing. Israel had evil desires, and God was not pleased with them. Going back to 1 Corinthians 10, starting in verse 7, it says, "Do not be idolaters, as some of them were, as it is written, the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play. We must not indulge in sexual immorality, as some of them did, and 23,000 fell in a single day. We must not put Christ to the test, as some of them did, and were destroyed by serpents, nor grumble, as some of them did, and were destroyed by the destroyer." So we see they've sinned. They've sinned in idolatry. They've sinned in immorality. They've sinned in testing God and grumbling against God. But what preceded these sins? Let's go to Exodus chapter 19. Exodus chapter 19 sets the stage for what was going on before they fell into these sins. They've been wandering through the wilderness. They were brought through the Red Sea. They're going through the wilderness, following the pillar of fire, following the cloud. And now they've been brought to the mountain, Mount Sinai. And they're camping there. God appears to them and he instructs Moses to prepare the Israelites for a special day. They are to cleanse themselves. They're to spend 3 days preparing for something very special. And there are many warnings given to communicate how sacred this day is going to be. There are to be limits set. They are not to touch the mountain. They are not to go up the mountain. They are not, if anyone touches the mountain, they are to be put to death. Imagine how intimidating that would be as you're camped at the bottom of this mountain. You withdraw, you set a boundary. This mountain is going to become deadly in 3 days. And then there's to be a trumpet. And when the trumpet blasts, at that point, permission has been granted. And then they shall come up the mountain. So Moses passed these instructions along to the people in verse 14, and he told them to be ready. And then on the morning of the third day in Exodus 19:16, it says, there were thunders and lightnings and a thick cloud on the mountain and a very loud trumpet blast, so that all the people in the camp trembled. Then Moses brought the people out of the camp to meet God. And they took their stand at the foot of the mountain. Now Mount Sinai was wrapped in smoke because the Lord had descended on it in fire. The smoke of it went up like the smoke of a kiln, and the whole mountain trembled greatly. And as the sound of the trumpet grew louder and louder, Moses spoke, and God answered him in thunder. And the Lord came down on Mount Sinai to the top of the mountain. And the Lord called to Moses to the top of the mountain. And Moses went up. And he told Moses once again to warn the people, don't let them break through, consecrate them. They cannot come up the mountain, set the limits around the mountain. And so Moses went down and told them. So just imagine this in your mind. You've been waiting 3 days for this to happen. There's thunder. There's lightning. This mountain is shaking. There's fire. There's smoke. Not just any smoke, not just like a little campfire, but a raging kiln. There's smoke billowing up. And with this setting, God spoke words. In chapter 20, verse 1, saying, I am the Lord your God. What an introduction. If you were to meet God in that setting, what kind of impression would that leave on you? We see events where public figures come out, there's light shows, there's music, and then they appear. Those don't compare a bit to what we are reading here. An entire mountain shaking, an unshakable thing. What mountain shakes? And yet God is shaking this mountain. God is engulfing it in smoke and flames. There's the sound of a trumpet reverberating around them. And then he introduces himself. I am Yahweh, your Elohim. I am the eternal, self-existent one. I am the supreme God. I am the one who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. And then he gives his first command. You shall have no other gods before me. What kind of impression would this leave on you? You've seen the one true God. You've been living under his provision. You've seen him part the waters of the Red Sea. You've seen him decimate the most powerful empire in the world, Egypt. You've seen him lead you with a cloud, with a pillar of fire. You've seen him shake this mountain. Is there any doubt in your mind at this point that he is the God and that you shall have no other gods before him? Yet he gives this command. And he continues down, giving the rest of the 10 Commandments. And at the end of that, in verse 18, it says, Now when all the people saw the thunder and the flashes of lightning and the sound of the trumpet and the mountain smoking, the people were afraid and trembled. And they stood far off and said to Moses, You speak to us, and we will listen, but do not let God to speak to us, lest we die. Moses said to the people, Do not fear. For God has come to test you, that the fear of him may be before you, that you may not sin. The people stood far off while Moses drew near to the thick darkness where God was. As soon as Moses enters the darkness, he once again reiterates this command in verse 22. He says, Thus you shall say to the people of Israel, You have seen for yourselves that I have talked with you from heaven. You shall not make gods of silver to be with me, nor shall you make for yourselves gods of gold. So here's number 2, no other gods before me. In chapter 24 of Exodus, Moses comes back out. He offers sacrifices. He writes these laws down. He reads the book of the covenant to the people. So, they've heard there shall be no other gods before me yet again. And then in Exodus 24, verse 9, it says, Then Moses and Aaron, Nadab and Abihu, and the 70 elders of Israel went up, and they saw the God of Israel. They saw the God of Israel. How easy it is to gloss over those few words. Perhaps it takes up such a small portion of the text because it just can't be put into words what they saw. They saw the God of Israel. There was under his feet, as it were, a pavement of sapphire stone, like the very heaven, for clearness. And he did not lay his hand on the chief men of the people of Israel. They beheld God and ate and drank. So now they've seen God from afar, enveloped in the mountain, or enveloping the mountain in the flame of his glory. And now, whatever it means, they've seen him once again. They've seen his glory in some way once again. It's indescribable. So now Moses has written down the book of the covenant, but God wants to cement this law even further. And so he tells Moses in verse 12, the Lord said to Moses, Come up to me on the mountain and wait there, that I may give you the tablets of stone with the law and the commandment, which I have written for their instruction. So this isn't just God kind of having a whim, like, okay, I'm going to impress people today. No, God is laying down a law that is going to be in stone for centuries to come. This is a monumental moment in history. And God wants to communicate that to the people. So now Moses, he waits to be called up to the mountain into the cloud of God's glory. And he waits. A day goes by. He waits. Another day goes by. He waits. Another day goes by. He waits an entire week. On the 7th day, God finally calls him into the cloud. And he was there for 40 days. Now we switch back to the camp. How many times have they been told, you shall have no other gods before me? But we go back to the camp. And remember, this is all within the span of 40 days. I don't know if this is on day 38 or if it's on day 17, but at some point in the span of 40 days, how much can you forget in 40 days? Well, apparently you can forget God. Chapter 32. They're getting impatient. It's easy for us to look back and say, oh, well, he was there for 40 days, but as far as they were concerned, Moses was gone. They had no idea when he was coming back. They weren't going to wait for him. They were ready to move on. So in Exodus 32, it says, when the people saw that Moses delayed to come down from the mountain, the people gathered themselves together to Aaron. Remember, Aaron was there. Aaron beheld the glory of God. But they gathered themselves before Aaron and said to him, Up, make us a gods who shall go before us. As for this Moses, this man who brought us up out of the land of Egypt, we don't know what happened to him. So Aaron said to them, Take off the rings of gold that are in the ears of your wives, your sons, and your daughters, and bring them to me. So all the people took off the rings of gold that were in their ears and brought them to Aaron. And he received the gold from their hand and fashioned it with a graving tool and made a golden calf. Wait a minute. I thought we just read a few chapters back. You shall have no other gods. You shall not make any gods out of silver, out of gold. Yet somehow there's a golden calf here. Okay, maybe it's just a calf. Maybe it's not actually a god. Oh, wait. And then it says, they said, these are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt. Wait a minute. So they're actually making this calf and calling it their god. Then when Aaron saw this, he built an altar before it. So he's participating in this. And then he made a proclamation and said, tomorrow shall be a feast to the Lord, a feast to Yahweh. So now we not only see idolatry, but we see kind of a confusing thing. First of all, I mean, think about all the work you've got to put into making a calf. It says he fashioned it with a graving tool, which is a lot different than what he said later to Moses. I threw stuff in the fire and out popped this calf. It looks like he put a lot of sweat into this. And then after he has it built and, they announce that it's the gods who brought them out of Egypt, then he says, tomorrow we're going to have a feast to the Lord. So he's kind of trying to justify this in his mind. Yeah, this is for God. This is for Yahweh. I'm not sure what a calf has to do with that, but he's still somehow trying to link this to God. And then it says in verse 6, the verse that's quoted in 1 Corinthians 10, and they rose up early the next day. They're eager to do this. They're up early. And they offered burnt offerings and brought peace offerings. And the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play. We know as we go forward, it's at this moment when all this chaos is going on that Moses comes down from the mountain with Joshua. He's been forewarned by God that they have already fallen away. He comes down and he is angry. He is angry. He's heard this command about no other gods echoed in his ear from the voice of God himself over and over again. He spent 40 days with God on the mountain. And somehow, the people have already drifted into the very thing that God commanded them first not to do. He is angry. Moses' anger in Exodus 32:19 says, his anger burned hot, and he threw the tablets of his hands and broke them at the foot of the mountain. Moses was burning with anger. Aaron was complacent and compliant. Your view of God impacts, it's directly linked to your view of sin. Moses had a big view of God because he had just been with God. And so he saw sin for what it was, rebellion against the Creator. Aaron, on the other hand, pulled back from the presence of God, stayed with the people, and he forgot who God was. He forgot the glory of God. And he became complacent. So the key point here is to have the correct view of God and the correct view of sin, we must remember what he has said and what he has done. 40 years later, in Deuteronomy, we see Moses giving the law once again to a new generation. The old generation has been wiped out because they have rebelled against God. And God said, you shall not enter my rest. So this old generation has been wiped out. Now we have a new generation who has grown up, and they are about to enter the promised land. So Moses goes through and he once again reminds them. Deuteronomy chapter 4, starting verse 9, it says, only take care and keep your soul diligently, lest you forget the things that your eyes have seen, and lest they depart from your heart all the days of your life. Make them known to your children and your children's children. How on the day you stood before the Lord your God at Horeb, the Lord said to me, gather the people to me, that I may let them hear my words, so that they may learn to fear me all the days that they live on the earth, and that they may teach their children so. And you came near and stood at the foot of the mountain, while the mountain burned with fire to the heart of heaven, wrapped in darkness, cloud, and gloom. Then the Lord spoke to you out of the midst of the fire. You heard the sound of the words, but saw no form. There was only voice. And he declared to you his covenant, which he commanded you to perform, that is the 10 commandments. And he wrote them on 2 tablets of stone. And the Lord commanded me at the time to teach you the statutes and rules, that you might do them in the land that you are going over to possess. Therefore, watch yourselves very carefully, since you saw no form on the day that the Lord spoke to you out of Horeb, out of the midst of the fire. Beware lest you act corruptly by making a carved image for yourselves in the form of any figure, the likeness of male or female, the likeness of any animal that is on the earth, the likeness of any winged bird that flies in the air, the likeness of anything that creeps on the ground, the likeness of any fish that is in the water under the earth. And beware lest you raise your eyes to heaven, and when you see the sun and the moon and the stars, all the host of heaven, you will be drawn away and bow down to them. You be drawn away and bow down to them and serve them, things that the Lord your God has allotted to all the peoples under the whole heaven. God is not like, God cannot be fit into the likeness of a male or a female. God cannot be fit into the likeness of an animal. God cannot be fit into the likeness of a bird. God cannot be fit into the likeness of anything that crawls around on the ground. God did not appear in any form on that mountain. So what that tells me is that God is unlike anything that you've ever laid your eyes on. It does not do him justice to put him into any image that you can see. He just can't be contained. His glory cannot be contained in anything that we can create. So the instruction here is keep our souls, the instruction for them is keep their souls diligently. Watch themselves carefully. Diligence. Carefulness. Does that describe your Christian walk? If you were to look at me, would you see diligence? Would you see me being very careful to make sure I was honoring God as the only God in my life? I was not putting anything before him. In order for us to finish this race strong, diligence is paramount. What's diligence? Dave Ramsey said, work is doing it, discipline is doing it every day, diligence is doing it well every day. Diligence is consistency. Diligence is excellence. Diligence requires us to throw off any sort of temptation to be lazy or complacent about our walk with God. Let's flip back to 1 Corinthians 10. We're going to jump back into verse 11. Now these things we talked about, some things we didn't talk about later on in their journey, but these things happened to them as an example, for they were written down for our instruction, on whom the end of the ages has come. Therefore, let anyone who thinks that he stands take heed lest he fall. No temptation has overtaken you, That is not common to man. God is faithful, and he will not let you be tempted beyond your ability. But with the temptation, he will also provide a way of escape that you may be able to endure it. So you may think you've had this amazing experience. You may, just like the Israelites before Mount Sinai, you may feel like you've had this amazing experience. But it's in those moments when you think you stand, take heed lest you fall. Diligence. We must be diligent every day because we can't put our Christian life on cruise control and expect to be victorious in the end. So we've got to know our enemy. 1 Peter 5:8 says, be sober-minded, be watchful. Your adversary, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion seeking someone to devour. So how do you protect yourself around the roaring lion of the devil? Well, a great place to start is to avoid where lions live. And if you can't avoid where lions live, then maybe avoid times when you're vulnerable to an attack by a lion, like maybe avoid the nighttime, maybe avoid areas with obstacles where a lion could be hiding behind the rocks. Of course, I'm speaking figuratively. And if you must go through those areas where maybe it's dark, maybe there's places where the lion could hide and ambush you, maybe you need a guide who understands lions better. Maybe you need to carry protections against a lion. Maybe you need that firearm. Maybe you need lights to illuminate the landscape around you so you can't get ambushed by a lion. We have to understand the enemy, and we have to face the enemy appropriately. Genesis 4, after the incident with Cain and Abel, the Lord said to Cain, why are you angry? Why is your face fallen? If you do well, will you not be accepted? And if you do not do well, sin is crouching at the door. Its desire is contrary to you, but you must rule over it. Remind yourself every day that sin's desire is contrary to you. Sin hates you. The devil hates you. Out of his spite for God, the devil wants to drag each one of us down to destruction, down to the pits of hell. And because we would not be attracted to sin if we recognize its true nature in every situation, sin appears and tries to draw us in with temptations. Satan appears as an angel of light. He doesn't appear in his true character most often. So the key, as we read in 1 Corinthians 10, is to remember that with every temptation, God provides a way of escape. There's always a way out. There is always a way out. But the way out is not always resisting. The way out sometimes is running. It says in 1 Corinthians 10, 14, therefore, my beloved, flee from idolatry. Flee. Do you know what idolatry looks like? Do you avoid any hint of idolatry? There's more I'd like to say, but I really want to leave you with one thing. And it's just the fact that in our walk, we need to be intentional to be successful. I want to read one more passage from Deuteronomy 6 that drove this point home with the children of Israel. Deuteronomy 6, verse 6, it says, and these words that I command you today shall be on your heart. You shall teach them diligently to your children. You shall talk of them when you sit in your house, and when you walk by the way, and when you lie down, and when you rise. You shall bind them as a sign on your hand, and they shall be as frontlets between your eyes. You shall write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates. Are you immersing your family in God? Or are you pulling back from the mountain and forgetting what the glory of God looks like? If you're just exposing your family to God in this building, that's not going to protect you from the devil. Because the devil doesn't go to sleep. He starts working when we leave this building. What are you doing to protect your family? Are you bathing them in the promises that God has given us? Because we need to remember. We need to remember. If we forget, our story will look no different than the story of the Israelites. And God's efforts to give this to us, as 1 Corinthians 10 says, so that we may learn from it, is going to be in vain. Let's take the lessons from the Israelites and take them to heart and recognize that God cannot be contained into anything, so nothing should come before the place of God. Fill your mind with the glory of God. Fill your mind with the good, the beautiful, the excellent, the true. Bathe your family, immerse them in the Word of God every day. Be intentional. Don't be complacent. If we can assist you in this journey in any way, please come forward as we stand and sing.